Welcome, fellow project managers, PMPs in the making. You know, as you're getting ready for the PMP exam, there's certain information you need to know. And I'm going to jump straight into it. It's page 9 in PMBOK 8. That table has got a breakdown like so. It's got 5 items at the top, which we call focus areas. And these are simply, I prefer extra money in cash. That's the mnemonic. Or I prefer eating mangoes chilled. This is called the 5 focus areas. In the past, they were called process groups. Okay. So these 5, you got to understand what they are. These just help to group the ideologies of the processes that you're working on as a project manager. You got to initiate the project by working on initiating processes. You got to plan the project by planning everything that needs to be planned. You got to execute the project, and there's overlap in all of these areas. Okay. There's monitoring and controlling, and then there's closing. And those are the 5. And the PMI are not going to quiz you parrot fashion, but the logic of how they all flow, that you need to know. Okay, so we call those focus areas now. And on the far left, we have 7 performance domains. And these performance domains are as follows. I'm going to give you a mnemonic to remember these domains. Now, for this one, I want you to use your imagination. Let your imagination run wild. We have a mnemonic that goes like this. George saw 7 fat squirrels reading reports. Now that's a picture that you'll never forget. 7 fat squirrels reading reports. And this is an image that will be very hard to forget. So it just stands for governance, scope, schedule, finance, stakeholders, resources, and risk. George saw 7 fat squirrels reading reports. It's straightforward enough. Follow along with me. It's going to go very quick. At the top here, we have the initiating process group. What do we do in initiating? Initiating is where we kick off the project. This is where we create the project charter, and this is where we identify our stakeholders. The next area, or group, if you will, is called planning. Planning is where we plan all the components that need to be planned. Even a common vacation does need to be planned, right? How much more a project? The next one that we have here is executing. I prefer eating mangoes chilled. So this is executing. And just remember what we do in executing. We get the work done. It's the group of processes that are supposed to help us effectively lead and effectively execute on the work. The next one that we have here is monitoring and controlling. Monitoring and controlling is where you check the status of the project, where you report on the status of the project, and it can also be where you act if things are going off course and awry. Finally, we have the closing focus area. This is the best way, my friends. This is like the rites of passage for those who really want the PMP to go through them and not just have them going through the PMP like a mindless ritual. This is going to help you because you're going to write it down, and I want to challenge you. Only write down what makes sense. If this is not making sense, I want you to drop me a comment below, and I want you to ask, okay? I want you to ask me, hey, Phil, I don't understand this. I don't understand why you said X, Y, or Z, and I will explain it for you. I do promise to answer the questions that you have about this. It's very important. I went through this rites of passage just like many other people have, and going through it and being able to write it out, it just shows that your brain has compartmentalized the aspects of project management, and you have a clearer path for how things flow. So there are going to be some instructors that say, no, you don't have to do it. But I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I know the value of doing this. I've trained my colleagues, I've trained government institutions, and they all say, I wish I had done it. It wouldn't have hurt, you see. All right, so we've got I prefer eating mangoes chilled. Now we're going to the left-hand side. This is where it gets to be fun. Okay, so here we have the very first one, George, and that's governance. What is governance? Governance is a framework within which authority is exercised. Governance is all about what are we allowed to do, what are we not allowed to do, whose responsibility is it, whose accountability is it. You know the difference between responsibility and accountability? Responsibility is the doer. Accountability means Passing the buck stops here. This is the ultimate accountability. All right, next one that we have here, my friends, is scope. George saw. Remember what he saw? Yeah, he saw those squirrels, 7 of them. So this is scope. Scope is like a telescope, right? The telescope analogy is you look through the telescope and what do you see? It's magnified, it's clearer, it's larger, right? So scope management is meant to help us do just that. After scope, the next thing we talk about, George saw, how many things did he see? 7. 7 fat squirrels. It's pretty straightforward. 7 is actually a favorite number. So for those of you who share that same favorite number, just remember your favorite number, 7. All right. George saw 7, and this stands for schedule. Schedule management is all about managing the time aspect on the project, making sure that you do things according to the schedule. So schedule management is all about managing the time aspect on the project. And then we have F for FAT, which is for finance. Oh my goodness. Yes. Finance is all about the money, the cash flow, the cost, and things such as that, making sure all of that is planned and effectively managed. George saw 7 fat squirrels. This next one is S, and it's S for stakeholder. Stakeholder. Who is a stakeholder? Stakeholder is anyone who could be affected by the project or impacted by the project. There we have it. George saw 7 fat squirrels reading. What were they reading? Reports. So when you think of them reading reports, the R that comes last is the R for risk. The R we're going to put here is R for resources. Okay. R for resources. And that's how it is in the 8th edition. They list it in that manner. All right. Resources. Resources refers to any kind of resources: human, equipment, materials, supplies, facilities. All right. And this is risk. A risk is an uncertain event that if it happens, it could impact your project positively or negatively. So now, my friends, we have our 5 focus areas and our 7 performance domains. This is great, but there's a greater level of specificity that we are going into right now. And I'm going to walk you through them very quick. In initiating, there are a couple of things that we do, and I'm just going to go down the list like that. The first thing we do in initiating is we initiate the project or the phase. Now, what does this mean in actual fact? This just means you're authorizing the project. Okay, we're going to use a different color so that you follow along. Let's put this in, actually, let's put this in black. Make it different from everything else. Okay, here we go. So when you hear the term initiate project or phase, that culminates in a project charter that is created that gives people an understanding of the project. It authorizes the project and it authorizes the project manager to apply resources to the project. Next, going over to stakeholder management, there's one thing that happens here and it's called identify stakeholders. You got to identify the people who the project may affect. They could be customers, they could be end users, things like that. You want to make sure you do a good job. And that's initiating. Initiating is the easiest, or one of the easiest, I should say. Now, as opposed to just doing it all the way through in lines, I'm going to do it in columns. And I'm not going to do it from beginning to end. I'm going to jump around a bit. So you got to follow me. Okay. The next thing we're going to address is closing, because this is low-hanging fruit. Very easy. The only thing we do here is called close project or phase. Sounds familiar, right? Because we have initiate project or phase. You can initiate a phase or you can initiate a project as a whole. A phase is a segment of the project, and you could authorize that, right, as an organization, or you could authorize the entire project. So we've completed 2 of the columns out of 5. Not bad, huh? Okay. Well, we have 37 things left to talk about. Now, at this point, I want to show you some of the commonalities that exist in all of these domains. All of these domains, they generally have the word a word, a keyword. So in planning, we have a process that is called integrate and align project plans. What do we mean by integrate? Well, the plans need to speak to each other. It's not enough to have a project plan with disjointed information. The information needs to make sense and needs to speak from one part to another. So scope and schedule need to gel, cost needs to gel, resources needs to gel with everything else, if that makes sense. So we have integrate and align project plans. Why this makes sense is in all of these domains, we're involved in some sort of planning. So watch this. We have in scope a process called plan scope management. See that? I want you to go ahead and write it with me. As I'm writing, you be writing as well. So that's plan scope management. We also have, going down the list, we have one in schedule called plan schedule management. And all you're doing is planning how you're going to manage this knowledge area. How are we going to manage scope? How are we going to manage schedule? You got it. How are we going to manage the finances? So we have plan financial management. And this is how the logic works. You just keep asking, okay, I did this in this process. What am I likely going to do here? So now we're in stakeholder. What do you think? Another plan, right? Here we have plan stakeholder engagement. This is how and where you're planning how to keep your stakeholder engaged, how to keep their eye on the right thing, how to keep them focused, because some stakeholders get distracted, okay? And then going down to resources, what do you think we have there? Yeah, plan resource management. You see how easy it is to fill this up? Because as opposed to you cramming line by line, just look for the patterns, and that is an easy way for you to conquer this table. They're definitely not going to ask you parrot fashion questions, but you got to know this stuff for your own sanity and for your own direction. Highly, highly advised. Then we have plan risk management here. Well done if you guessed it. Okay. Plan risk management. You see, that didn't take too long, and the table is beginning to fill up pretty quick, isn't it? Yeah. All right. I'll just give you a heads up that risk is a big area. We're going to have to kind of stretch some of these down. I'll kind of move them down. I'm going to have to join them up somehow. Or maybe just use this to get them down to the end, because risk is a big one. Risk has got 4 different things in planning, so I don't want that to hold us when we get to the right spot. Okay. Now going back up, this is where you would fill in the gaps, and this is where you kind of need to think. Okay, there's some of these that are not as, what's the word, intuitive. So in planning, as you're planning everything, you also need to plan a sourcing strategy for what you need to purchase from outside of the firm. And that's why here we have plan sourcing strategy. Okay. So far, pretty much everything on the screen has made sense. But for some of you, plan sourcing strategy might sound a little bit obtuse, a little bit abstract. So I want to speak to that for you, okay? When we talk about planning sourcing strategy, it is a process of deciding whether to use internal or external resources for different parts of the project. You're going to consider factors such as your organization culture, specialized skills, resource capacity, things like that. So it's like, are we going to make it? Are we going to buy it? And if you decide to buy it from outside, then you got to have a solid plan, solid strategy. Okay, so that's that. Going down the list to scope management, it's one thing to plan how to manage scope, but then in order to flesh scope out, you have to elicit and analyze the requirements from the customer. We just call it analyze and elicit requirements. It sounds like a mouthful. It just used to be called collect requirements in the past, but I understand the need for specificity of analysis and the need for the word elicitation means to draw out, So it's not a coercion, it's a drawing out. All right, going over to the next one, we have define scope. Define scope is where you are getting a better handle on what is included in the project and what is not. So here we look at inclusions and we look at exclusions and we look at detailed deliverable descriptions to better understand the work that needs to be done in order to get those requirements satisfied. The next thing that we have here in scope is called develop scope structure. And develop scope structure is very similar to a family tree process where you're trying to understand the higher levels of the project and the lower levels of the project. When you understand the higher levels of the project and you understand what is in the project and you can visualize it in hierarchy, like parent, children, it does wonders. It works absolute wonders. And that's why the work breakdown structure is used a lot. Now, if you're in the world of Agile, you might use product backlog items and a breakdown of those. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. All right. So we talked about plan schedule management. In plan schedule management, we have a few things that happen within it. We have defined activities. We have the sequencing of activities. We have the estimating of the durations for the activities. All of this happens in develop schedule. So plan schedule management is how we're going to develop the schedule. Develop schedule is where we have define activities, sequence activities, and estimate activity durations. So we have develop schedule. And that is a loaded one because it's very involved. There's a lot that goes in there. So don't let its small size fool you. Okay, that's develop schedule. Now going into finance, we have a couple of things here. So after you have planned financial management, the next thing to think about is the estimates. And we just call this estimate costs. All right. And then finally here in this column for budget, we have what we call the develop budget. And the budget will contain things such as contingency reserves, the task cost that you've estimated, and things such as that. Next thing that we're going into is stakeholder, and you can see we have plan, stakeholder, engagement. In this edition of the PMBOK guide, they married communication in here. So we have two plans. We have plan stakeholder engagement and we have plan communications management. Okay, it's quite straightforward. It's planning what you're going to communicate, how often, why, and things such as that. Okay. So we're coming down to towards the end of planning. We're doing quite well. Next thing we have here is resources. And there's a couple of things we do. We plan how to manage the resources, and then we have estimate the resources. Estimate resources. This used to be called estimate activity resources. I don't get hung up on the terminology as long as I know what is being done. All right. And last but not least, under risk, we have plan risk management, but we also have identify the risks. It's one thing to decide how to manage the risk, but you got to identify risk. And then you also have to perform an analysis, right? So we say perform risk analysis. All right. So identify risks is identifying the cause of the risk itself, and the effect. Then we have perform risk analysis. And lastly, in planning, we have plan risk responses. And there you have it, my friends. If you could go through this with me, like really paying attention and focusing and absorbing everything, you're going to do great. So we're right at kind of around the half mark. So if you've enjoyed it so far, smash the like button. So next, the logical thing to do is going to be this one. Let's move to executing. Now, when you look at executing, always think, what is the overall coordination that I could be doing at the governance level? Always think that. So in governance, we have overarching ideas and thoughts. In this case, this process is simply called manage project execution. And this is code for effectively coordinating all of the leadership-oriented processes across the project, because executing is where the work gets done. Manage project execution is where the work is done to create the deliverable. Also, as part of executing in governance, we also think about quality assurance. So we have a process called manage quality assurance. Well, quality is all about fitness for use, conformance to requirements, and customer satisfaction. Quality assurance is prevention. Quality control is cure. Prevention is better than cure. Manage quality assurance is checking to ensure the work is being done right, not cutting corners, making sure that you're not cutting corners, making sure that the right documentation is completed, the right work is done at the right time, things like that. Then we have manage project knowledge. And manage project knowledge is where we, just as it says, manage knowledge that's acquired on the project. We're talking about lessons learned that need to be shared across the organization. This could be in the form of tacit knowledge or explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is harder to convey. It's harder for you to convey tacit knowledge like in a document. You'd be better off meeting with a coach or an expert face to face so that you can get a firmer understanding of whatever knowledge they're trying to convey. But managed project knowledge is just that, lessons learned and sharing knowledge with the right people. Now, there's a very important aspect of this table that I want you to observe here. So between scope, schedule, and finance all the way down, there is nothing in these boxes. There is no executing process. When you think about it, there's no work being done as far as scope, schedule, or finance. You're monitoring and controlling, but you're not doing any executing work. And that takes us straight into stakeholder. Remember, in stakeholder management, we have to manage our stakeholders' engagement. And that's what this is, manage stakeholder engagement. And this just means you are communicating with the stakeholder with a view to engage them at the right level, the right time. And your eye is always on the ball. Make sure that your stakeholder is truly engaged, attending meetings, making sure you get what you need from the stakeholder and making sure the stakeholder gets what they need from you. And then the second thing we have here is called manage communications. And manage communications just means you are communicating with your stakeholder and giving them the information that you promised. You see, there's a difference between communicating to engage someone versus communicating what was planned. You see, each one of these, we could tie them back to their corresponding planning process. So planned stakeholder engagement is tied to managed stakeholder engagement, right? You planned to engage a stakeholder in meeting X, in meeting Y, with communication or artifact A, B, or C, then you make sure you're doing that, right? You do it. So in managed stakeholder engagement, that's where you do it. Now, I want to continue the stream of consciousness because I don't want you to lose focus on this very important discussion, because this is where a lot of students get lost. So I'm going to attack this right now, okay? So we have planned stakeholder engagement, we have managed stakeholder engagement, and I'm going over to monitoring and controlling while we're in this flow of thinking. We have a process called monitor stakeholder engagement. And monitor stakeholder engagement is like everything regarding stakeholder is all on that top line. Plan stakeholder engagement, manage stakeholder engagement, monitor stakeholder engagement. You plan how to engage a stakeholder. Of course, you first want to identify who they are. Then you plan how to engage them. You plan how to communicate with them. Then you engage them. Then you communicate with them. Then you monitor the engagement. And lastly, we have monitor communications. You ensure they are getting the communications that they need, that you promised. Because, you know, everything in the plan is like a promise. If you promise you're going to give the stakeholder a report on the last day of the month, you do it. And if you don't do it, then you need to get back in alignment with the plan. Okay. So I decided to just keep things flowing with that stream of consciousness for stakeholder, because it's easier to think about it like boom, 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 as opposed to let's do executing and then, you know. So this gives a lot of students cause for worrying. Oh, I don't understand the difference between manage stakeholder engagement and monitor stakeholder engagement. Manage is doing, monitor is checking to make sure they're engaged. Manage communications is doing, monitor communications is checking to make sure that the communication is going according to the original plan. Okay, so my friends, moving on to resources. Resources, we have a couple of things we do here. So think about the flow, right? We talked about plan resource management and then estimate how much resources you need. Well, the next logical thing is to acquire them, right? So acquire resources. That makes sense, right? We're talking about human, equipment, material, supplies, facilities, whatever the resources are. And then we have the next one, which is lead the team. I was so glad they changed this to leadership because it used to read as manage team, but it was really code for leadership. And I'm glad they changed it to lead the team because that's what you do as a project manager. You lead. The word manage is overrated. People don't understand. In the words of Steve Jobs, management is making people do what you think they should do or what you want them to do. But leadership is inspiring people to do the things they never thought they could. That's the mark of a good leader. It's the inspiration, not the carrot and sticks. All right, let's move on to our final one in risk. This is just simply called implement risk responses. And that means you are carrying out your responses to risk. And if you haven't watched the videos where I'm going deep on all of these processes, you might want to check the channel. So hit subscribe so you don't lose it. And then look at all the PMBOK 8 breakdowns because I go into sufficient detail about every knowledge area, which is why it wouldn't make sense to do it like that all over again. I'm glad you're following along. All right. So that's pretty much it for executing. We had 3, 6, 7, 8. We had 8 there. So at this point, I think we've pretty much covered everything. We just have a few left. So let's go to monitor and control. Monitoring and controlling focus area, as they call it. So here, again, think about the governance-oriented things you're doing as a project manager, as a high level, right? You're monitoring and controlling the project at a macro level. So we're just going to call it monitor and control project performance. All right, so there we have monitor and control project performance. And the second one that we have at this level is all about change. And this is called assess and implement changes. And it's all about managing changes across the project. Okay. Moving into scope, we have a couple of processes. We have monitor and control scope. And this is ensuring that the scope being worked on is indeed what you promised in the beginning, that you're not gold plating or adding extras. And then we have one that is called validate scope. And that just means your customer is validating that you have indeed completed the work based on the scope they shared with you and that you agreed on with them in the beginning. And then we move into schedule management. We have monitor and control schedule. And you see they all are taking this monitor and control convention. See that? The next one, monitor and control finances. And that just means you are checking to ensure you've not overspent, you've not gone over budget, things like that. All right, we've already completed the one for stakeholder. So we go straight to resources. And again, it has a similar ring to it. Monitor and control resourcing. You see how easy it's becoming, because when we were in planning, we talked about planned name of the domain management. Well, now we're in monitor and control name of the domain. That's it. Monitor and control scope, monitor and control schedule, monitor and control finances, monitor stakeholder engagement. So we can't control the humans. That's why we don't have monitor and control stakeholder, right? And then communications is human related. We don't want to control people's communications, but we want to monitor to make sure it's going according to plan. Then we have monitor and control resourcing. And then for risk, you cannot control uncertainty. So we say monitor risk. Monitor the uncertain events that could impact your project positively or negatively. It just makes sense. All right. So if you count the number of processes that you have, right, in each of these columns, that will tell you if we are done. And finally, my friends, let's take a look at the numbers. It's important to understand the implication. We have 2 in initiating, 19 processes in planning, 8 in executing, 10 in monitoring and controlling, and 1 in closing. We have 9 in governance, 6 in scope, 3 in schedule, 4 in finance, 7 in stakeholder, 5 in resources, and 6 in risk. And that is the matrix. This matrix is extremely helpful in explaining how project management works. Now, there is a line of best fit that this represents, okay? And the line of best fit is as follows. So now I'm going to show you what I call the PMBOK mainline. And the PMBOK mainline is like the 80-20 rule of the PMBOK guide. You often hear things like 20% of people do 80% of the work. Well, here, 20% of the processes are critical. Without this 20%, you don't really have a good end result. So I'm going to show you the critical pieces of the project. If you get this blanket view, you're golden. All right. So the first one I want you to really think about is initiate the project or phase. You must initiate the project for it to be authorized. Secondly, you must identify your stakeholders. Otherwise, what are you really doing? Get it? Initiating the project or phase is a direct input to integrating and aligning plans. Without your project charter, you don't know how to effectively combine everything. And that's why integrating and align project plans is dependent on developing the project charter. The next high-level mindset you need to have is, I get my plan and I manage project execution. As I'm executing the work and getting things done, I am checking to ensure things are going well so I don't produce rubbish. But then I am also collating my lessons learned. So all those three are important. Checking the work as it's been done, finding out lessons learned and sharing them. And then as the work is being executed, you got to go to validate scope, because that's where your customer signs off on whatever you've created. You also, at the same time, as you're executing the work, you're going to be monitoring and controlling project performance. And if validate scope has gone according to plan, then you are going to close project or phase. And if you have that high-level mindedness, everything fits up into the governance section, more or less. You see, pretty much everything that I was highlighting was up in governance. There was only a couple, validate scope and identify stakeholders, that were outside. Okay? So with that in mind, when we take a look at the entire map, I want you to think like this. There are two ways I want you to think. Without having to cram, I just want you to think about the very important things we talked about. We talked about initiate project or phase, and there's a line that is going to go all the way from there, from initiate project or phase, all the way to close project or phase. And to get a holistic idea of PMI's framework, you must be able to answer what happens along the way. What are the critical things that happen along the way? Okay, so high level, we identify the stakeholder. High level, we integrate the plans. High level, we execute the work. We collate the lessons learned, which is what we call manage project knowledge. But we talk about the lessons learned. Then we think about the validation of scope. But when we talk about validation of scope, it's very important to understand the order of things. So while validate scope is important, we best want to think perhaps at this point of what really happens in parallel. Monitor the project. We're monitoring and controlling the project. And then we are, of course, validating the scope. And that's pretty much it. We get to close project or phase. And I just think about this as a main line of sorts. Everything else that happens in project management is plugged in. Schedule, or I should say finance, is plugged in there. Everything is plugged in. You can plug all the other processes in to this big old mainline, if you will. And that's how you need to get a holistic idea of project management. When you have this level of understanding, when you look at your table, you're not looking at the table as this pretty finite shape. This shape could morph and change and get very ugly very quick, because it's not always happening 1 and 2, then 3. No, it's all over the place. You could be initiating a project on day 1, and on day 2, you could be acquiring resources. You could be hiring team members. You see, the mindedness needs to be, there's possible overlap in a lot of these areas. And remember that in a hybrid environment, you're doing these things in iterations sometimes. It's not always a one pass through. It gets ugly. So when the PMI gives you questions, they will not be dressed up like, oh, you're in governance. You just finished plan sourcing strategy. What do you do next? No. They stopped asking those kind of questions long ago. So cramming the table is not the value. The value is going through the process to understand what is being done and the flow. And when you understand the flow, the common sense of it, you're going to do better. Think about Phil. He's a project manager on a project and he's hired. Then the question usually goes, what does Phil do first? Well, if Phil knows what he's meant to be doing, he should want to first get his project charter. He wants to identify stakeholders, that's for sure. And then he starts getting into the planning. But the planning has to make sense, right? He typically would think of a structure for all the plans. Then he would typically think about how he will manage scope, and then he will collect the requirements. Then he will flesh out the requirements into some concrete ideas about what needs to be done to get those requirements, which we call defined scope. He will then take that information and perhaps use it to develop a schedule, to develop some budget. And then he's already started doing a lot of these things by then, planning how to engage stakeholders, planning how to acquire the resources and effectively manage the resources. And then he does it, right? He communicates. He does all of these. He's already started the project. So these are in motion anyway. Then, of course, he will think about risk management all the time, right from day one, right? But you get to a point on some projects where formally you must have a risk register. It has to be approved. You must have a risk management plan. And if that's the case, these have to be done before you move into the project in earnest, or done to some degree. And all throughout the project, just look at monitoring and controlling as it's all through. That's the life of the PM. And you're going to close phases sometimes, and then other times you're going to close entire projects. And that is the mindedness as to how project management works for your PMP exam. I hope this was of value to you. If it was, smash the like button. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. There'll be more videos and quizzes. And just so you know, a lot of the quizzes that are already on the channel, they are actually good for your quizzing pleasure, right? Because things haven't so dramatically changed. Terminology might have changed a little bit, but the general idea and the situational questions are still very similar. All right. If you haven't watched my boot camp, 16-minute nano boot camp about what is new on the PMP exam, what is changing, please look for it, and we'll go from there.